Well, I've got a special guest today, Dr. David Perlmutter. If you know about wheat belly, you know about grain brain, you know all about Dr. David Perlmutter. Well, one of the things I love about Dr. Perlmutter is when I read his material, when I read his books, I can count on learning something new. We all know this. Most ideas, most books are copycats or just a little bit of new material. It was a surprise to me reading Drop Acid, his newest book, that page after page, I learned something new, something I did not know before. So I thought it'd be best to bring Dr. Perlmutter himself on to the podcast to hear it from the horse's mouth. So welcome, Dr. Perlmutter.
The horse's mouth, that's me. Nice to see you again, Bill. How's everything?
Things are doing great too. So we have books coming out virtually at the same time. So yours February 15th, mine February 1st. But, tell us how you came to this. I first heard the premise, uric acid. But uric acid, we all know uric acid, it's a risk factor or it's a measurement for gout, hyperuricemia. But I never conceived of it as being a causative factor. And that was the real revelation in Drop Acid. But how did you come to that idea?
That's actually, it's true. And there's a fabulous study that came out in 2016. It was a collaborative study from researchers both in Turkey and in Japan. And the title of the study is Uric Acid and Metabolic Syndrome from Innocent Bystander to Central Player. So, we've been observing elevated uric acid in diabetics, in patients with obesity and hypertension and problems with their lipids for years, and thinking, well, that's interesting. They got uric acid elevation as well. They are at risk for gout. But now we understand that it's just doesn't happen to be just an innocent bystander. It's playing a causal role in these issues, in metabolic issues, in metabolic syndrome. And that's a big problem, metabolic syndrome in and of itself. We recognize now that 88% of American adults have at least one component, one of the five components for metabolic syndrome. So that means only 1 in 8 American adults is metabolically intact. And, how did I stumble upon this? Now, now that I've written this book, I realize there's an incredibly robust amount of research out there, and it's been out there for years. And like yourself, I was not aware of it. And it came to me one day when I was out running. It didn't just come to me. I'm running, but I'm listening to a podcast. And it was an interview by Dr. Peter Attia with a researcher at the University of Colorado named Dr. Richard Johnson, who really deserves so much of the credit for bringing, again, uric acid to light. And I say, again, I'll talk to you about that in just a moment. But really, making us aware of the central role of uric acid in our metabolic maladies, the metabolic mayhem of our time. And let's be clear, obesity, overweight, diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, these are powerful underpinnings of our most dreaded conditions, including Alzheimer's and coronary artery disease and diabetes, and yes, even cancer. So this is a big deal. And so I'm listening to this podcast while I'm running, and I couldn't get enough of it. It answered so many questions for me. I'm a neurologist, as you know, and you wrote Wheat Belly about general body health and metabolism. I wrote Grain Brain, more about the brain. But I think, one thing that you and I have both focused on over the years is that refined carbohydrates are killing people and making them metabolically messed up. But we haven't really, and we've known, for example, that fructose is a huge issue as it relates to that. That was described in the Journal of the Lancet way back in 1970, but we haven't really understood how and why that happens. And when I was listening to the podcast, then the mechanisms became clear. You and I have both talked many times to Dr. Robert Lustig. We get what's going on with sugar and metabolism, but to understand how it happens, I think it's been a revelation. So I did what anyone would do, and I picked up the phone and called Dr. Richard Johnson and said, hey, I heard your podcast, amazing stuff. As a neurologist, I'm interested in metabolic issues because they relate to the brain, they relate to Alzheimer's and other problems. And we began a relationship and took it from there, to the extent that, he told me that he had a new book coming out 1 week before my new book about this topic. And after a while, we bonded, and I ended up writing the foreword to his new book, and I ended up dedicating my book to him, and really to honor him. I mean, he's done the work, and I'm, reporting the work and making it, packaging it such that people can understand it and then make changes to their health destiny based upon what they will learn about uric acid, which you and I learned related to gout and kidney stones, end of story. And now we know that it is a central player in, our metabolic dilemma that we find ourselves in these days.
If I understand, you would actually elevate it to the status, say, of blood sugar.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think that by the end of reading Drop Acid, people will realize that, this is a metric that needs to be followed like blood sugar, fasting insulin, waist size, body mass index, body weight, insulin sensitivity. Perhaps if you want to get a little bit romantic about it, maybe some inflammation markers, but it needs to be, and it's going to be, right up there with all of those very important metabolic measurements. And, frankly, people who are reading Drop Acid likely have already had their uric acid checked. It's part of your annual blood work. Really, in the context of gout, who has gout? Not very many people, 3% of American adults. But it's, as I say, so far beyond gout in terms of its importance. And now that people recognize how important it is, you can buy a monitor for not a lot of money and measure it at home, just like you put a drop of your blood on a card and measure your blood sugar. And people are doing that now. We describe how to do that, why it's important. And then, of course, the book goes into the relationships to our metabolic issues, what's causing uric acid to go up, and then finally, at the end, what's the call to action? How do we fix it?
Do you often have to resort to drugs, allopurinol, other things in order to gain control over, or is it purely a dietary lifestyle kind of solution?
It's a very good question. So the main go-to drug for elevated uric acid in gout patients has been allopurinol. And it turns out that experimentally, people have been using allopurinol in humans and certainly in animals who have elevated uric acid because they've been put on a high fructose diet. That's what you do. If you want to elevate uric acid in an experimental animal or in human subjects, you load them up with fructose. Well, who in the world is going to eat fructose? Well, most Americans. I mean, they are eating, 55 grams of fructose a day. It's an incredible amount. And how is fructose metabolized into something called uric acid? Directly. So that's what's done. And then what is noted is that if you inhibit uric acid production after you give humans high dosages of fructose, then they don't get high blood pressure, for example. So it really focuses, by using that drug, on the importance of uric acid as the player, as the mechanism by which fructose raises blood pressure and fructose increases body fat. We'll talk about exactly what that means and how that happens. But no, the book is not about allopurinol. We mention it quite a bit in discussing the experimental research, but we know that, for example, luteolin, which is a bioflavonoid, is as effective as allopurinol in inhibiting an enzyme called xanthine oxidase that makes uric acid. So we can get away with things like lowering uric acid with a dietary approach and then using some creative supplements like quercetin and luteolin and vitamin C that have been time tested to lower uric acid. Now, might there ever come a time when somebody might need a drug? Yeah, of course. And that's the time when you reach out to your healthcare provider and say, look, my uric acid level is still elevated at 7. I need it to be below 5.5 for my metabolism. Is there anything else I can do? Maybe that doctor will say, well, we'll try a little bit of allopurinol. Brings up another point. Elevated uric acid traditionally has been at a level of 7 milligrams per deciliter or above. And those numbers are derived as they relate to kidney stones or gout. But as it relates to your heart, as it relates to your body weight or your blood sugar control, your blood pressure, we need to keep uric acid at a level of 5.5 or lower. So the so-called normal range is well and good, but it's not what what my patients or anybody reading this book needs. They want the optimal range. They want to know what's best, not just what is average. We need to do better than what is average. And, you know, certainly you've been talking about that for many, many years.
Has it been your experience that most people can manage to achieve that ideal or optimal level of uric acid just using lifestyle methods?
That's right. And in fact, you know, that's even what the literature shows. And a lot of that literature has been generated in the context of gout, looking at diets that are associated with lowering uric acid. And maybe we should talk about what are those dietary factors first that raise uric acid. And uric acid in the human body is only made from three things. The first is something called purines, and purines are the breakdown products of DNA and RNA that are found in our bodies, found in our foods. The second source is alcohol, but by and large, by far and away, the biggest source in humans of uric acid is the metabolism of fructose. And in fact, when you look at the consumption of fructose as a sugar in Americans from around 1900 until the present, that uric acid levels have skyrocketed in lockstep with our fructose consumption. You know, around 1900, Americans were consuming around 15 grams of fructose a day by having some fruit, having a couple apples, all well and good. Because those are foods that have a small amount of fructose, and they have fiber, and they have vitamin C, which helps lower uric acid. So they don't threaten uric acid. Matter of fact, fruit is associated with lowering of uric acid. But in lockstep with our incredible consumption now to 55 grams of fructose a day, our uric acid levels have gone from 3.5 as an average in 1920 to now over 6 as we have this conversation, again, in lockstep with our consumption of fructose. Yes, alcohol matters, specifically the type of alcohol. And yes, purines matter. Certain foods high in purines like organ meats matter. But the big issue is just this onslaught of fructose in the the Western diet, when we see that close to 70% of foods in the grocery store have added sweetener, and by and large that's fructose or a derivative of high fructose corn syrup. What is it doing? It's making people metabolically unfit. And how does it do that? Through this mechanism of raising their uric acid. So if we can rein in from a dietary perspective those inputs to uric acid, that's more than half the battle. I mean, that's the biggest part of this story, is that, yeah, the gout diet was important for gout patients, but now that we recognize this metabolic connection, you bet you've got to lower your purines. And interestingly, when you look at the recommendations for people with gout, it's by and large focus on purines. You know, don't eat a lot of fermented cheeses and limit your alcohol consumption. And they kind of conveniently avoid talking about the biggest source, and that again is fructose. That's fruit juice. That's sweetened beverages and soda, and my goodness, sauces and all kinds of condiments, and fructose added to so many foods and medicines and baby food, you name it, just because we all have a sweet tooth. And we have a sweet tooth because that's a powerful survival mechanism, and explains why we as human being primates have elevated uric acid. It's an incredible story. It dates back about 14 to 15 million years ago, when the earth became cooler, and the human ancestors, our primate ancestors, had a lot of pressure, survival pressure, because food became scarce. And over more than 1 million years, there was a selection pressure for those to survive who made more fat and whose blood pressures could be just a little bit higher, because there was not enough water and food was scarce. So those who had just some slight genetic mutations that allowed them to make and store body fat and to increase their sugar production to power their brains would survive and pass on whatever genes that there were that allowed them to survive. Well, it turns out that those genes, that suite of genes, actually this was an interesting article in the Scientific American, had to do with the function of an enzyme in the human body called uricase. And that is an enzyme that breaks down uric acid. And what the gene modification did was it stopped the production of uricase. So those animals that couldn't break down uric acid, what would happen to them? Their uric acid levels would come up. They would make more fat. They would store more fat. They would make more blood sugar so they could power their brains. Their blood pressure would come up, and because their uric acid levels went up. Now, you, Dr. William Davis, and I, and every human walking the planet, we all have that uricase mutation. It's why humans' uric acid levels are 4 to 5 times higher than that of other mammals, except, of course, for primates, because it was in the day a powerful advantage for us and for our more recent Paleolithic ancestors as well during times of food scarcity. So it proved very helpful when the environment was such that it threatened us. It threatened our survival because we didn't have enough food. Well, that's not where we are today, right? We're pounding ourselves with food, and we are absolutely involved in that mechanism that thinks that we're not going to have food tomorrow or water tomorrow. And therefore, what is it doing? It's packing on our body fat. It's raising our blood pressure. It's stimulating our livers to make more glucose, called gluconeogenesis. And it's this classic example of what is called an evolutionary environmental mismatch. And it is the underpinning for virtually all of our chronic conditions on the planet today. According to the World Health Organization, that is the #1 cause of death. It's not COVID. It's not any other infectious problem. It's the chronic lifestyle-related degenerative conditions that have at their core dysfunctional metabolism. And now that we understand the pivotal role of uric acid elevation in causing these problems, wow, it's a really powerful tool for us. And it really gives us an advantage now that we never had before.
That's brilliant, David. You know, I think you made Charles Darwin turn over in his grave when you said survival of the fattest.
Yeah, I hope he didn't turn over in his grave. I hope he just gave a thumbs up, because this is absolutely deeply involved in, his theory that subtle changes, as he discovered in the Galapagos Islands, subtle changes between birds and reptiles cultivated the survival of certain species in that particular environment. And, what our genome hasn't changed. Our genome hasn't changed to any significant degree in over 70,000 years, but the environment has changed. And it is now, that mismatch is something I began publishing about. My first publication on that topic was in 1971 in the Miami Herald when I was 16. I was concerned about how we aren't going to evolve rapidly enough for the incredibly changed world in which we find ourselves. So again, this environmental mismatch that doesn't line up with our current, with our genome. I mean, that's the foundation of the so-called paleo movement, where we're trying to regain connection to what our genes want to see, that are trying to keep us healthy and alive and allow us to reproduce and pass on our genome. That's deeply threatened today.
As you well know, so the traditional notion of gaining control of uric acid, some with gout or uric acid kidney stones, is essentially a low purine diet and one of the drugs. I think most will know a low purine diet is kind of tough to follow. So what role do you think a limitation of purines plays in somebody, let's say, without gout, but has a uric acid blood level, say 6.3? Is there still a role?
That's way up. I would certainly be uncomfortable with that level. And I would say that it plays some role. Understand that 2/3 of the purines, which are, again, breakdown products of DNA and RNA in your body, are endogenous. They come from the recycling of your own muscle material in your body. And therefore, vigorous exercise will actually increase your purines and increase your uric acid transiently. 1/3 of the purines then are exogenous. They come from the foods that we eat. But does it play an important role? I'm going to say not that important. I think if a person has really done due diligence and gotten rid of the fructose, But that doesn't mean you can't eat fruit, but gotten rid of the obvious sources of high levels of fructose from their diet, and still hasn't made any improvements or enough improvements in their uric acid, you definitely want to then be more deeply involved in lowering your purine consumption. But look, when you add 500 milligrams of quercetin to your diet, and maybe 100 milligrams of luteolin, and maybe some vitamin C as well, you're going to really dramatically improve your uric acid levels. One study from England looked at 22 young males who had mild elevation of the uric acid, and they realized an 8% improvement, which is significant, in 2 weeks of just taking 500 milligrams of quercetin each day without any specific dietary change. So again, one for one, quercetin is almost as effective as the drug. So and there are a lot of tools in the toolbox now, and that's the empowering part about people who are wanting to be the architects of their health destiny. There's a new sheriff in town. There's a new tool in the toolbox that I think is very, very empowering.
I know you've been, as I've been, very involved in the microbiome. In fact, my interest in the microbiome began with your invitation to attend your conference on the microbiome.
I remember that, Miami Beach.
Right.
No, Fort Lauderdale area. I remember that.
What role do you see for the microbiome in uric acid metabolism?
Well, elevated uric acid has three important effects or concepts that relate to the microbiome. First, it, for whatever reason, seems to select out pro-inflammatory bacterial species. The next thing it does, directly and secondarily through the change in the species, is it increases gut permeability, and that's certainly not a good thing. Increased gut permeability obviously relates to inflammation, the central mechanism across the board in these chronic degenerative conditions that we are talking about, but also dysregulates the immune system. This leaky gut is associated with autoimmunity. It's associated with metabolic issues, as one might expect. The third interesting fact that relates to the gut is that for several years, we've seen research that's shown a dramatic reduction in flare-ups of gout in individuals who've undergone a procedure called fecal microbial transplant, where basically fecal material, it sounds distasteful, from a healthy person are transplanted through a colonoscopy into the gut of somebody, in this case, with gout. And first of all, why would anybody even do that experiment? Because it's been recognized that gout is an inflammatory condition, and the gut regulates inflammation. Maybe it would help if we did a fecal transplant, and has been shown to be dramatically effective in lowering the rate of recurrence of these gouty attacks. So, gout is inflammation, and it's a bit beyond just having high uric acid. Certainly high uric acid then is taken advantage of by this gout situation in the formation of these gout crystals, the uric acid crystals that form in the joints. But there are other players. That inflammation tends to fan that flame. And this relationship then between uric acid and inflammation, between uric acid and the gut, and uric acid and metabolism, may well explain why people with elevated uric acid, when they are COVID infected, have a dramatically increased risk, as much as threefold, of being placed in the ICU, of being placed on a ventilator, or even succumbing to that disease in relationship to having a high uric acid level. So, it's certainly timely that we think about why uric acid control really is so very important these days.
Well, that's interesting. It makes it really a very immediate problem, doesn't it?
It does. But, even in the longer run, larger studies, one study that looked at 42,000 men and 49,000 women, followed them over 8 years, demonstrated that those individuals who had the higher levels of uric acid had a 16% increased risk for what is called all-cause mortality, which means dying from any cause. And if you specifically look at cardiovascular death, a classic inflammatory situation, as you well know, their risk of dying from a cardiovascular event was increased by 39%. Increased risk of death from stroke was increased by 35%. And interestingly, the for every point of elevation of the uric acid level over 7, there was an 8 to 13% increased risk of death from any cause. And, you know, when you see people that come in with a uric acid level of 9 or 10, knowing what I just explained is pretty breathtaking, especially in the conclusion of that report. Again, you know, close to 100,000 people, they determined that a quarter of, in this population, of the diabetes in the group that they studied was caused by elevation of uric acid. And diabetes is a big issue, you know. 80 million Americans are either pre-diabetic or full-blown diabetic, and that's a bad thing to have. That may as much as quadruple your risk for an incurable disease for which there is no meaningful treatment, called Alzheimer's. So we've got to keep ourselves from becoming diabetic, and certainly getting control over uric acid is a powerful key to help that happen.
You know, I have to admit to you, I never even thought to do a finger stick or other kind of test for my uric acid. But what's the mechanics of that, David? Just go to Walgreens, CVS?
Or online. I'll send you a kit. I count on it. I'll send you a what's called UAssure, UASURE monitor. You can buy it on Amazon, but I'll make sure you get one. And you'll check your uric acid, and then maybe we can get together on Zoom and you can tell the world, or, you know, we can talk, or you can post it on Instagram. But I think it'll be a good idea to know your uric acid level. And I think possibly you'll be surprised. And that'll be a good thing, because now you've identified something and you can work on it. And yeah, it's great to measure your waistline, your blood pressure, you know, your lipids, all the other things, your blood sugar, that's for sure. You know, I use what's called a continuous glucose monitor, because I'm very, very much involved in knowing my blood sugar. But uric acid is really another powerful tool for your toolbox.
Dr. David Perlmutter, this has been brilliant, truly. I don't read that many books where I learned something new and I didn't know. I read Dr. Perlmutter's book, and truth, there's a ton of usable, actionable, insightful information in this book. The book is called Drop Acid, of course. Thank you, Dr. David Perlmutter. My pleasure. The website for the book is dropacid.com. And, you know, the title, of course, might throw people off, but it's not about anything else but uric acid. So there you go. Where else can people find your conversation? I know you have a very active Facebook page. Facebook is David Perlmutter, MD. I think the best place to start is DR for doctor, drperlmutter.com. That's sort of the on-ramp for all the things that I do, the podcast and all the things that I do to get information to people. Terrific. Excellent book, David. Thank you very much. Thank you.